Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dwayne David Paul. I'm the director of the Collaborative Center for Justice. I just want to sort of note before my colleague Rachel introduces herself that we are recording this and it'll be shared on our Facebook page. So if you want to sort of share that out with folks, but also FYI, that means that you're also being recorded. And so that'll be in this sort of large room as well. And when we sort of break out into small rooms as well, little breakout sessions for a conversation that's a little bit more intimate and intentional. Rachel?
Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel E. Scott. I'm the Associate Director at the Collaborative Center for Justice. And thank you all for being here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Collaborative Center for Justice, we are an advocacy organization based in Hartford, and we're sponsored by 6 congregations of women religious. Our mission is to advocate for systemic change and educate individuals on various social justice issues in order to improve the lives of people who are poor and vulnerable. And we carry out our mission through a number of different activities. One is organizing a prayer partners program for community members to pray for our elected officials. We also engage in advocacy and lobbying. And we also engage in community organizing, as well as arrange and facilitate educational opportunities.
So tonight's conversation is a part of the center's educational mission. We share ideas and build knowledge together, not for its own sake, although that can be really enriching, but rather to help build a community and to more competently, call upon the values of our various faith traditions as we work toward justice. So in that sense, the sort of title of this sort of group of programs is Public Theology Conversations. And so in that sense, public theology isn't a project just for people with specialized training. It's for everyone who wants to sort of marshal their religious commitments or even their curiosities to build a common good. And so Rachel's going to explain the format of this evening's conversations. And
So in a moment, we'll begin with a moderated discussion with Dr. Milton Javier Bravo for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then after that, we will break out into small groups, as Dwayne mentioned before, for some conversation. And we'll have a question to guide that conversation. And then we'll end the program with a few words about what we can do in response to what we hear this afternoon.
Great. So I'm really pleased and excited to introduce a very dear brother of mine, Dr. Milton Javier Bravo. He is the Director of Audience Development at Commonweal Magazine, which is a Catholic review of politics and culture. He's also a lecturer in philosophy and theology, and as of last week, I think, a newly minted PhD. And so we're all applauding in our little Zoom frames. And so, Rachel, why don't you get us kicked off with the first question for Dr. Bravo?
Sure. So we know that the Trump administration has enacted policies and practices that have fundamentally changed the asylum system and have made it very difficult for asylum seekers to get protection in the United States. Policies such as the so-called Remain in Mexico policy, the various iterations of family separations, and new restrictions put into place at the border during the pandemic. And so these have all created barriers and real harm for individuals and families who are seeking asylum. And so we know that the Trump administration has also set historically low levels of the number of refugees that can be resettled in the United States. And these policies really erode the US reputation as being a welcoming place for people seeking safety. So we wonder this afternoon, with the backdrop of these policies in mind, if you could reflect on and tell us about your experience at the border. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to Dwayne and to Rachel for hosting these conversations, providing this space to enter into dialogue and as we like to say, God talk. Anytime that 2 or 3 are gathered and doing this kinds of discussions, they're doing theology, as Dwayne mentioned, regardless of special training. And so, before I answer the question sort of directly, just a couple of things, or perhaps a couple markers that might be helpful for you to know where my thinking comes from, and how I've approached the ongoing issues that people of my community, Latino, Latinas, that are seeking asylum in the United States have faced. First and foremost, I'm an immigrant myself. My family and I migrated to the United States in the mid-1990s, and we settled here in the state of New Jersey. And I'm always very much conscious of my own privilege, because my family was able to find a path towards residency, permanent residency, and citizenship in the United States. But I know several families and several of my friends and several members of my communities here in central New Jersey that weren't as lucky to have that path. And I say this because I obviously went on to complete my bachelor's, master's, and now finally done with the doctorate program in 3 Catholic universities in the United States, 2 of which were Jesuit Catholic universities. And within the curriculum, within the theological department, within the campus ministry spaces, within the educational departments, the experience that continued to be missing, that continued to be sort of invisible in the midst, was the Latino experience, the Latino cultural and religious, experience. And it wasn't until I finally, about 2 years ago, decided to write my dissertation on Latino theology with an emphasis and a focus on how young Hispanic students are experiencing their cultural and religious beliefs, rituals, and symbolisms so important to Latino theology. It wasn't until then that I finally encountered sort of this community of scholars that have always been present and yet absent from the curriculum, right? In the late 1980s, 2 Latino theologian scholars, Virgilio Elizondo and Arturo Bañuelas and Father Alan Figueroa Deck, really 3 of some of these great theologians, began the Academy for Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. And they really wanted to seek out young Latino, Latina, pastoral leaders, lay leaders, working in parishes, working in dioceses, and provide paths to leadership, provide paths towards graduate studies and doctorate studies. And in so carving a space within the academy that was really our own, right? And it wasn't until those 2 years ago that I finally found in the academy, in this space of theological reflection, an experience that I could see myself in, right? And a couple of things about Latino theology, I think, influenced my own thinking and have influenced the way that I've approached the Mexico-US border. By the way, in parentheses, it's just great to have a theological conversation because of my daytime gig, as Dwayne mentioned, we're doing journalism, and we're doing Catholic media. And so it has to be sort of one framework that guides the discussion. And obviously in my teaching, I'm always leading first-year students into the introductory material of theology. So this is actually really refreshing to have this kind of conversation with you all. Close parentheses. So 2 items that are really essential, I think, that have influenced Latino theology and are so relevant for the discussion. One is understanding that the Christianity that was brought to the United States during the colonial period, as early as the late 1400s, early 1500s, and the Christianity that encounter the native, indigenous communities, especially in the Caribbean, especially in Central, what now is Central America, as well as the Mexican territory and parts of nowadays United States, was this pre-Tridentine Christianity. a pre-Council of Trent Christianity, which is certainly different than what we later came to sort of experience, particularly with the foundation of this nation in the 1700s, a Catholicism that was already post-Council of Trent. And why is this point really essential? Well, one, in a pre-Tridentine Christianity experience, the emphasis is on enculturating the faith and on the performative expression of the faith, and how that faith is lived not within an institutionalized manner or in a building, but rather in what Latino theologians call lo cotidiano, in the everydayness of the experience. And where is the everydayness of the experience? It's with family, it's with loved ones, it's with friends, it's in the communities that we inhabit, it's in the places of formality and informality. And it is there that Christianity is alive for the Latino community. And then the second part of that, this notion of a pre-Tridentine Catholic reality that has been so essential for Latino pastoral and theological reflections. The second component is this notion of mestizaje. And this mestizaje, mestizo, in English is translated, it's a mixing of races, a mixing of biological, mixing of communities, mixing of cultures. It is this encounter of cultures and this mixture that occurs. Certainly, Latino scholars and pastoral leaders will say that, the first mestizaje, the notion of the quote unquote, the new American people, if you will, happened, during those times in the late 1400s and early 1500s between the indigenous communities and the Spaniard and Portuguese Catholic colonizers. The second sort of mestizaje that has been unfolding has obviously seen the late 1800s and early 1900s with sort of this expansion of the Protestant, predominantly Anglo-Euro-American expansion into the South and Southwest, where they encounter the Mexican-American community. And now this is now my personal knowledge. And now there's a third wave of mestizaje happening now. This ongoing mixing of the different cultures, especially here in the United States, with continuous flow of migration in migrating communities, as opposed to the Irish, the Italian, the Polish, the German migration periods, which had both a beginning and an end date. For the Latino community, it's a better framing to say that there are waves of migration, and those waves have come and have resided and then have continued, and so on and so forth. There's really no stopping. And so we're going to continue we're going to discuss a little bit more about the militarization of the US-Mexico border. But I think theologically, it's important to put these two items in context. The cultural Catholicism, as important for Latino and Latina communities, and the notion of the mixing that is so essential as well for the reality. Because this informs the way that we do theology and the way that we approach pastoral work. The notion that combines this is called teología de y en conjunto, pastoral de y en conjunto, theology and pastoral work that doesn't just work and manifest itself in the academy and a classroom, but it is embedded in the communities, it is embedded in the families, it informs both the ecclesial reality, but it also informs the society at large, but is truly embedded in people's everyday existence and everyday lives. So I'm going to come back to that US-Mexico question, I think, in a second, but wanted to frame that to start our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so, I mean, I think as you sort of build upon that framing and the the question of the sort of like political and like policy reality at the border, and but specifically sort of like your experience in sort of procession there, right, or participating in that. I also, I kind of want to think about, as you alluded to, the militarization, not only of the border, but the ways in which like the border are themselves a kind of laboratory for both like state violence, right? In terms of different sorts of like policing forces, like Border Patrol, the Texas Rangers, like that sort of kind of wing of things, and also like vigilante violence, right? As we saw in 2019 in El Paso. So if you could sort of think about like the sort of insights that like came from the community, one that came from your experience at the border crossing, and then two, the sort of insights that like, of the border as a laboratory, and the sort of insights around that from the community, that'd be great.
Thank you. So one of the things that occurs throughout the U.S. is these Encuentro Process with Hispanic ministry leaders, both in the local, diocesan, then in the regional and national level. And the Encuentro Process provided an opportunity in June of 2019 to bring a bunch of Latina theologians, scholars, lay leaders, pastoral leaders, priests, journalists, to the University of Notre Dame's the Institute for Latino Leadership. And you may recall that at that point in 2019, we had seen the zero tolerance policy of this administration already had come and had created so much trauma and created so much damage for the borderlands communities. We had seen how that zero tolerance policy then morphed into this sort of family separation at the points of entry, particularly this one in El Paso, Texas, at this site of the northern bridge of the pass from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico to El Paso, Texas. And we had seen those images of children in cages. And so as we were sort of reflecting on the reality here of the United States for Latina communities, that was the backdrop of that meeting in June of 2019. And we were very upset, right? We were all very, very upset. To quote Father Brian Massengill, who quotes Thomas Aquinas, righteous anger was certainly the feeling during that time. And so we decided as a community of leaders, Latino leaders, to go and visit the Mexico-US border. And we were led by two community organizing groups, by two leaders, one out of Chicago, Michael Okensi Cruz, and another one based in El Paso, Dylan Corbett. And Dylan Corbett's organization, the Hope Border Institute, was the site that would welcome all of us into that space. So as we were prepping to head down to the Mexico-US border and bring as many partners as we could, we labeled this as first a pilgrimage. We then labeled it as a teach-in. I'm sure if you're familiar with the Ignatius Solidarity Network, the teaching network, which is happening now, I believe, virtually. We wanted to sort of also mimic that experience, but not only do a pilgrimage in an educational component, but also do a public action to call for justice in this space. And so we brought college students, we brought universities, we brought other organizations, nonprofit organizations, and as we were preparing for that process. In August of 2019, the El Paso was the site of the largest anti-Latino massacre in the history of the United States, and one of the top 10 largest massive shootings in the United States, when a white young man drove over 700 miles and shot 23 Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans because of this quote unquote Hispanic invasion that he had in many ways absorbed, mentally. And so as we were preparing to sort of deal with the trauma that was happening with the asylum process ending essentially in the United States, we were also dealing with this blatant, act of white supremacy, racism, and as what Latino and Latina theologians call an act of domination, right? This was happening as we were preparing. So we went to El Paso in October of 2019. There was a lot of different articles and sort of media around that moment. I think the educational experience was essential. I think uplifting the voices and the narratives of the local community was also essential. I'm always in awe and impressed by you, people like you, Dwayne, and people like you, Rachel, folks that are doing community organizing, who are doing research, who are doing public advocacy for changes to policy. And then what occurred? Well, we wanted to bring this performative expression of Catholicism in some way to the Mexico-U.S. border. And so as a community, there were over 300 people that had gathered from all the United States in that site. We did a procession with cymbals, with music, with guitars, with singing. And we, did this, what's known as this Jericho walk around the USMexico border, blessing that site, providing, flowers, providing these sort of not only symbolic gestures, but true symbols that carry so much meaning and value for Latino communities. And then a couple of us, and I was part of this this smaller group, we crossed over into Ciudad Juarez to meet the migrants that were there camped out on that side. And, as we spoke with them, we realized what was happening, that the Trump administration had not only essentially sealed the border and sort of stopped the asylum process, but the Border Patrol agents themselves had taken upon sort of the legal aspect of this and were making, asylum claims and stopping these asylum claims, not in the court, but on the line of the border. We met families, young people. There was this one family that had 3 children, one who was very, very young. That every time I think of that moment, it breaks me down, and it should. And those are tears of encountering the Lord in the people. And all we were to do was to accompany the migrants. We were not supposed to speak for them. We were just supposed to be there and help them exercise their agency. And so about 15 migrants entered the bridge that connects, like I mentioned, Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. The smaller group that was accompanying them were in the back. And as they reached the center of the bridge, they were denied entry. They had all their paperwork. They were not, these monsters that, we heard in 2015 and into 2016 from the Trump, presidential run at that moment. Families, young people with all their paperwork on hands, and they were stopped and not allowed to enter into the United States. At that point, as you're looking around, and I'm thinking, have I ever seen this in Canada, in the US Canadian border? I mean, it's barbed wire everywhere. It's just an overly abound presence of military, both people, but also trucks and armed soldiers. And as you're thinking, man, this is truly a site of just the militarization that has occurred. This is a clear example of it in this community. And, 30 minutes go by and more soldiers appear. And it was all an act of intimidation. And as we have seen in the reporting from the borderlands, cruelty is the point. There's no other point to do this. It's just to be cruel to the neighbor, to the stranger, to the one who comes knocking on our doors. All we could do at that moment was pray and wait. And then eventually they were led into the United States. But even then, who knows what happens next? Some of them get put into the hieleras, these ice boxes that are meant to just, bring you down, completely strip you of your humanity. Others are sent back to remain in Mexico and await the asylum claim. And then COVID occurred, right? And we had this ongoing pandemic. And as we spoke with members of Hope Border Institute, the community organizers there, we saw how the Trump administration had used the pandemic as yet another excuse to truly close the border. Bishop Mark Seitz, the Bishop of El Paso, has said that this country never has this happened, that in this country asylum is no longer an option. And so I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to say a little bit more about the experimentation and the militarization aspect in a minute.
Thank you. That's really powerful. We really appreciate you sharing what you saw and what you experienced and what people are experiencing at the US-Mexico border. I'm curious, this might be shifting gears a bit, so you might want to, I don't know if you want to kind of say more on the militarization piece before answering this next kind of question that I'm thinking of, but I'll put it out there. We talk a lot about the root causes of migration, right? That people come for a variety of reasons, and often people are fleeing extreme violence and famine and climate change related issues and extreme poverty. And so I'm curious, what kind of how you have encountered that, kind of how you've seen those root causes kind of play out at the border and with the people that you've encountered there.
So one of the things that is really, I think, powerful to think about the faith-based organizations that are doing the work. There is some presence from the, sort of official hierarchical church. And not every bishop in the United States is concerned with, their media platforms or writing op-eds for the New York Post. Some are actually doing the work. But faith-based organizations such as Hope Border Institute and many, many others are connecting communities, are building the relationships that are needed in order to bring about systemic change, right? Not only are there communities, obviously, that have mixed status families at the border, at the borderlands, but also within our backyards, right? In all of our states. This is why right now in 2020, the Latino community is estimated to be about 18% of the US population. By 2050, we're estimated to be about 30% of the US population, right? It is an incremental growth that is occurring and that will continue to exist. And so faith-based organizations are connecting folks from the borderlands with local communities throughout the United States, but also communities in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, to address some of these real causes of migration. And as you mentioned, people are fleeing violence. They are fleeing persecution. They are hoping to unite with loved ones in the United States who may already be here. They're also obviously escaping places of climate change that has occurred all throughout the world, but also in parts of the Caribbean, obviously in parts of Europe. And what's also very interesting to see is that the asylums seekers, the migrants that we see at the US-Mexico border are not only Latino, that's a majority of them. And the majority of them are also Catholic, which is always something that we need to keep in mind. We have shut the door to fellow Catholics, but there are also communities from the Caribbean, communities from Europe, communities from Africa, other communities that have also made their way to the Mexican side of the border to seek asylum. And what has occurred in El Paso? You know, there is a couple of different documentaries that I would really recommend you take a look at. One, I believe, was done by PBS targeting El Paso. And another one is actually one of these, you know, cooking shows, believe it or not. I think it's called Taste of the Nation, I think it's called. Both the targeting of El Paso by PBS and the Taste of the Nation, I believe is run via Hulu, give you this sense that when the Trump administration was building on what the Obama-Biden administration had done already, and created these zero tolerance, these remain in Mexico policies, these metering policies, these children in cages policies. What they were doing is they were using El Paso as a lab, as a laboratory to see how much they can get away with and how much they could, you know, not follow the rules, not follow the law. And then expanded those policies throughout the borderlands, utilizing the military and throwing sort of this notion of militarization into a social ill, right, in one way. And what occurred after the killing of George Floyd this year? We saw that same militarization experiment that was happening at the border in other parts of the country, in other parts of the nation, including Portland, but also we've seen it in Chicago, we've seen it here in New York City. And it's the same agents, you know, it's the CBP, it's the same agents that are not living up to the ideals of this nation, certainly not following the law, and violating people's human rights. And so when we think about sort of these roots causes of migration and these root causes of our communities, how do we overcome them, right? Policy is one way. And as we speak with, you know, the folks doing the work at the Mexico-U.S. border, you know, we're going into an election, you know, and I think there were a number of over 20 million people have already voted. I think that was the last number I saw as of yesterday. It may be more now, where we have a real chance for transformative action, right? It's not only going to take a Biden-Harris presidency. It will take, you know, the Senate and the House. It will take people of goodwill, not only undoing all the damage that has been done, but truly implementing transformative change, where in true immigration reform, the border is not held hostage. And again, it's military and funds are not thrown into these communities, these borderland communities. That is not going to resolve the issues. So I think that's I'm watching my time here. I know you also want to split folks up. I can certainly say more about this, but I think I'm gonna leave it there for now.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, so we will break up into groups as we sort of promised during in the sort of description. A part of this is to sort of get us all doing this sort of theological reflection on our experiences, on our commitments, on our curiosities. And so we'll break up into small groups with a question. I think we can take just a little over 10 minutes. So our question is, and you're free to interpret this however you will, how does your faith inform your response to these issues? How is your faith calling you to respond? And so I won't explain that anymore. I will repeat it once more, but this is a chance for us to sort of run with that individually. How does your faith inform your response to these issues? Or put differently, how is your faith calling you to do so? And that is also open to the sort of the curious, the questioning, the nuns, NONES, nuns. Yeah, so if you just give me a second, I will kind of break us up into small groups, and we can sort of build some knowledge together.
And for those of you who just came on, just a reminder that this is a recorded conversation.
Dwayne, as you're setting the groups, can I just say one final thought as they're walking into these groups?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. One final thought. As we were heading down to El Paso, the image that kept playing for many of us was seeing the borderlands as walking to the foot of the cross, understanding that it is a site of tremendous trauma, and the trauma has been packing and continue to be put on people's shoulders and people's lives. But we know that there is a resurrection. We are people of hope. There is Easter Sunday, right? And so as we think about Latino theology and many of the theologians that have worked in the borderlands, they will leave us with this sense that there is side of trauma, but that there is also a lot of hope and a lot of potential. And it is this sort of dynamic that is really at play, knowing that there are injustices happening in our communities, but we are the church. We can't wait for others to do the work for us. We can't wait for the bishops to do the work. And thank God for so many nuns, NUNES, for doing the work for us, and helping us and leading us. But lay people obviously have a call to action here. And that's the hope. There's trauma, but there's also a sense of hope. Thank you, Dwayne. Sorry.